Well, hey guys, thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry, where I'm about halfway through a faux beam project for a client, and I wanted to stop long enough to show you some of the techniques that I've come up with for transforming boards into beams. And to the untrained eye, this chunk here might look like a solid 8x12 beam, but in reality, it's just a faux beam made out of 1x12s and a 1x8. And the project I'm in the middle of involves making about 150 lineal feet of beams with the same technique and process. So I've developed some tips, tricks, and tools for transforming flat, regular boards into faux beams like this with a weathered, aged finish. But I've got to get this project wrapped up, so I'm just going to jump right in with both feet and show you what I got going on. I'll start with a quick overview of the arsenal of tools I use for transforming a flat, smooth, plain board like this. This stuff is called Pecky cypress. The wood is cypress and the holes in it are the pecky part, and that's created by a fungus in old growth cypress trees. And I recommended this wood to the designer and client to achieve an aged, weathered, antique barn beam look for the project. But the board itself, as you see it there, doesn't quite have enough character for the look that they're after, so here's a quick rundown of the tools that I use for the job. After making a long three-sided box out of boards like this, as you'll see, I start with a belt sander for smoothing out splices because these beams are longer than the boards I was able to get, and then I move through the various tools to achieve the look I'm after. First there is the belt sander. Second is a drill with a stiff wire wheel on it. I've got a die grinder with a carbide bit and an arsenal of bits for that die grinder. One of the main workhorses I have for this is an angle grinder with a graph carving disc on it. I've got a file, a sanding block, and the other key tool here is this little beast that's called a restorer. And along with these tools, I've got compressed air at the ready because this job is fast and efficient, but I can't say it's not messy. There's a lot of dust generated by this, as you'll see, but that's part of the process. I've also got safety glasses, dust mask, and earplugs that I'll use as necessary during the project. But rather than describe these tools in detail, I'll just put them to work and talk about a few of their features as I go through the steps with each one. As I mentioned, I've got about 150 lineal feet of beams like this to do, and just a couple hours ago, this beam here, which is 20.5 feet long, looked just like this one, which is almost 24 feet long. And I used the same steps on that beam that I'm going to show you and use on this beam. And one of the first things I do is use that belt sander, as I said, to smooth off the joints. And I've got one on this side of this beam. That's a splice. I used 45-degree angle splices, glued this together. And I've got some glue on the surface and just a little bit of unevenness from that joint. So I'll clean it up with the belt sander right now. Using the belt sander is probably the most routine part of the aging weathering process for the beams. So there's not a whole lot here, but I will tell you that I really like this Porter Cable 3x21-inch belt sander. It's compact, got plenty of weight, it's got good ergonomics, plenty of power to get the job done, and I've got a 60 grit belt on there to make quick work of the job and make sure that I'm cutting the wood flat, not just rounding it off. If you want more tips and information about better belt sanding, here's a link to a video where I go into detail about that. But there's much more information in that video than is necessary for this simple beam. So I'll just give you a quick close-up as I smooth out this splice. As you can see, a sharp 60 grit belt on this belt sander makes quick work of smoothing up the surfaces and removing the glossy glue squeeze out that would distract from the aged, weathered finish I'm after on these beams. I'm using a medium belt speed and steady, even pressure, along with controlled movement of the sander so that I don't excessively gouge or burn the surface. Bada bing, bada boom, but that's all there is to that. Even at 24 feet long, this 6x8-inch beam is surprisingly lightweight and stiff, so I can easily roll it over by myself to expose the section of beam that I'll use for the rest of this video. And there's a section right here that'll be a good example of all the techniques that I'm going to use. And the first step in the sequence I'm going to show you right now is doing some aging on the sharp corners that I have after the glue up. And to do that, I'm using my 5-inch angle grinder with a curved carving disc from the folks at Graph, who sent me this disc recently along with a flat one to try out on projects like this. And on the sample beam that I did previously, I used a belt sander and a 24 grit belt to ease the corners. But I can tell you this is a much faster, much more controllable process, and it gets a very nice result. So it's a win-win situation. And like the rest of these tools, there'll be links in the video description where you can take a closer look at them and or purchase them if you need them and can't find them locally. But thanks to the folks at Graph for sending this amazing little disc. Wait till you see how this baby works. In this close-up of the end of the beam, you can see the construction here. I just mitered these joints. These cuts are made at 45.5 degrees for a nice, clean, tight fit. There's no biscuits in here, and it's not a lock miter. That's just good Titebond 3 glue. And you can see in here some blocks that I used to create a rigid, straight, and clean beam without a whole lot of trouble. And for ease of construction, I didn't cut these miters to a razor-thin point, but left this small quirk joint in the corner because, as you'll see, that gets removed in the process I'm about to show you. If this was a real solid wood beam, I'd likely use a draw knife and just hand peel these corners, but what it actually is a couple of boards with sharp 45-degree miters, bevels cut on the edges, and the draw knife just tends to pull the wood and cause just big, unsightly splinters. So I put the draw knife away and break out the angle grinder and the curved carving blade from Graph. And I think you'll understand why. The goal here is to remove the sharp, clean quirk joint left over from the fabrication and assembly process to disguise the glue line and give the appearance of a solid chunk of wood instead of two boards glued tightly together. I use a medium speed on the grinder because this carving disc cuts so aggressively I don't need a lot of speed or power to get the job done and work towards a corner that looks like it was originally hand peeled and weathered. I work to use random positioning of the grinder and cutting disc to get a consistently uneven and random texture to the corner. And you can see by how quickly this short section I'm doing for the video that it doesn't take much time at all to do the full 48 lineal feet necessary to knock off the corners on this section of faux beam. There's a learning curve involved in working with this Pecky cypress, and I've made some progress on that curve myself, but I'm sure other people with more experience with this wood have additional techniques that can be applied, especially if they're after a different look. But one of the first things I learned is the nature of these Pecky pockets themselves. And I want to show you that now so you understand the next step, which is going to be to use this little wire wheel and a drill to enhance the Pecky texture on these pieces. An important thing to know about Pecky cypress is that the pockets in the wood are created by a fungus and not a bug. So these aren't wormholes, but they're little strips of basically rotten wood. I've got a little old stiff stainless steel wire brush here, and you can see how fragile this material is. Just like punky rotten wood sitting down in those pores. And I've also learned that the dust from those pores can be a bit irritating, so when I'm doing any volume of this stuff, I make sure to wear a good quality dust mask. But you can see how fragile it is. The dust just comes right out of those pores. The other thing to realize about this is when the wood is planed, there can be a Pecky pocket just under the surface, like here. This looks like discolored wood. But there's actually a pocket underneath there. And you can see in this section here, you don't necessarily need a wire brush to get that out. Because a blowgun with good strong pressure will take it right out of there as well. Another thing that's worthwhile to note is that Pecky cypress comes in different grades. The pieces that I ordered here are light to medium Pecky. You can get medium, heavy, light, etc., depending on the look you're after. I'll mention that the tools and techniques I am using here will work for any sort of faux beam, whether it has the distress of this peckiness in there or not. If these were just cedar or oak or whatever, the tools and the techniques would be the same. But I'm going a little bit off into the weeds here to explain the nature of the Pecky wood itself, which is notable here as I show you a little more about techniques I use to enhance that peckiness. And while I'm talking about enhancing the peckiness, it comes to bear for this next step, because as I said, some of the Pecky pockets are covered by just a thin layer of wood, and if I wanted less peckiness, I could just sand the beam and do some of the other texturing techniques. but in this case I kind of want to accentuate those. So cleaning out the pockets with the wire brush or the blowgun isn't quite enough, because if there's extra pockets that are hidden just below the surface, I want to open them up, clean them out, expose them, and then when I apply the stained finish, they'll be enhanced. And that's where the stiff wire wheel on a drill comes into play. And I'll just zoom in on this sample section to show you what I'm talking about. There's a couple of the pockets like I'm describing right here, and cleaning with the wire brush kind of breaks away some of the thin loose wood. But using this little wire brush gets the job done quickly, and it also textures the bottom of the pockets. And you can clearly see in this short clip the dramatic difference the wire brush makes in cleaning out and accentuating the Pecky pockets in this part of the beam. And while I'm at it, I'll do another little section here so you can see the transformation from the appearance of the surface before and after the little wire brush. And depending how the pockets open up, I'll run the brush both directions and also occasionally reverse the spin of the brush to get the look that I'm after. I'm doing a preliminary clean up and clean out of the Pecky pores near the splice in this beam as a segue to the next texturing step, where I'll use the die grinder and a carbide burr. I selected this section of this beam as the example for the video because of this feature right here. As you can see, the splice in the pieces of wood interrupts the natural flow of the Pecky pores, and I don't want to leave it like that because it would be an obvious seam after the beams are installed. So it's time to deploy a die grinder to remedy the situation. I've got a whole selection of these solid carbide burrs, and they're perfect for work like this, with the difference being their shape and the texture of the cutter itself. And the coarse cutters like that remove a lot of wood in a hurry, but they're kind of hard to control, and the small ones tend to clog up and burn. But for this section, I've chosen this kind of rounded, tapered bit because it kind of matches the contour of these Pecky pores. And you can see here the miter line cuts off this pore sharply there, but that's an easy fix with this tool and this technique. And I really like these quick disconnect couplers by Milton with their pressure release feature and straight pull action rather than twisting action, because it makes connecting and disconnecting pneumatic tools like this a breeze. And with a little imagination, you can see how this tool and this technique makes quick work of blending the boards into a beam. In this close-up, you can see a biscuit that's a byproduct of the joinery and assembly process I used for the beam. And obviously, a biscuit doesn't belong in a Pecky cypress beam, so I'm going to take that out of here in short order. Boom. Done. Depending on the contour and configuration about each individual section of the beam, sometimes I further enhance these artificial Pecky pores with another pass of the stiff wire wheel and the drill. And I think you'll agree that the texture in this section is fairly convincing and goes a long way towards hiding the splice in the sides of this beam. Well, I'm about to the bottom of my bag of tricks for putting a weathered texture on these faux beams, and I've saved the best for last. So I want to take a second to ask you to consider subscribing to Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. If you like videos like this with unusual in-depth topics, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. And while you're at it, take the grinder to the thumbs up button or hit it with a hammer or something to let the quants at YouTube know there's things going on here at Next Level Carpentry. As anyone who's seen videos from the channel before knows, look in the video description for all sorts of things that relate to this project, this video, and the world of Next Level Carpentry. Follow those links to tools, t-shirts, etc. And any purchases made there are the same low online price to you, but those various businesses pay small ad fees to Next Level Carpentry that help support video production here at the channel. So without further ado, I will reach to the bottom of my bag of tricks and whip out this sweet restorer tool. This particular one is made by and bought from Eastwood online. There'll be a link to this in the Amazon website, I believe. And the tool comes with a wide selection of different drums for using this, various Scotch-Brite pads, sanding pads, etc. But I am using the wire brush attachment for this project because it does exactly what's needed to put 100 years of age on this wood in just a matter of minutes. And I'll show you what that looks like on this section. And here's a close-up of the Eastwood Restorer tool. I bought this model because of the ergonomics. I like the trigger, the handle, the way this works. The one thing that this doesn't have is dust collection, which would probably be kind of a nice feature. But I thought the ones with dust collection were lacking in other areas that were less important to me. So I got this one. You can see here, I put directions on this. I've used this particular brush for probably 500-600 lineal feet of surface 6 inches wide. I flipped it around the direction one time, but there's really no sign of wear after all that use. Granted, I'm using it on fairly soft wood. This Pecky cypress and rough sawn cedar that I've used it for before is fairly soft compared to something like white oak. But the brushes last a long time and do a great job. When they start getting passive, I flip the brush side for side, which reverses the cut direction of the wire and really makes a difference on how the texture goes. But yeah, it's a medium weight tool. It's not heavy, but the handle is really ergonomic and allows me to position this tool for effective cutting on all sorts of different angles and really minimizes potential fatigue for what this tool is doing. As I gain experience with the Restorer tool, I've learned that I like to do the edges first to kind of clean off the marks left behind by that graph cutting disc, kind of do some random shaping as I'm at it, recontour in places like that, and start the texturing process. And when I zoom the camera in, you'll be able to get a close look at the miter joint on this. And as I said, it's not a lock miter, that's just miters that are glued together. I use a technique of cutting the miters at 45.5 degrees so they're guaranteed to be tight on the outside, which leaves a very convincing finished corner after the texturing process. But I'll zoom the camera in close here and you can see how those bristles tear up that wood. Oh yeah. You'll notice each time I fire up the tool that it has a nice soft start feature, so starting and stopping doesn't jerk your wrist like it might otherwise. And this is one of those times when I'm doing much of this at all, I'm wearing a good quality dust mask, because between the fineness of the dust and the Pecky cypress itself, it's pretty much a guaranteed sneeze fest without a dust mask. As you can see, it takes only a few seconds in any one spot to remove the cutter marks from that carving disc. So doing 48 lineal feet of corners on a beam like this probably takes less than 20 minutes. And you can tell by the way the tool kind of jumps around as I'm using it that the cut of those wire bristles, when they engage the grain of the wood, pull the tool in all different directions. So it takes a little getting used to, but the good news is you really can't screw things up when creating a heavy random texture like this. Once I'm satisfied with the texture on the corners, I just move to the flat surfaces of the beam. You can tell by the way the Restorer moves around on the wood that it's a little tricky to control and takes a bit of getting used to compared to other power tools. But it's all manageable and it's plenty worth the effort for the job it does and at the speed it gets the job done. I'll stop for a second to say that something I've noticed is when I'm putting the texture on a miter like this, where the long point of the miter is this way, the texture comes out better if the brush is spinning off the sharp point of the miter. It tends to blend that a little better, so there's less blending work to do after I'm done with this step. And in this panning shot, you can see the level of weathered texture that I can achieve in just a few minutes with the Restorer tool running at a low speed. I could use a higher speed and faster movement for less weathering, and a lower speed, more pressure, and slower movement for a heavier weathered texture, depending on what the project requires. Well, it's a good thing that I pre-warned you that this is a fast job, but it's a messy job. There's quite a layer of dust on the floor here and around the shop from everything that's just churning up. But considering the amount of work that's getting done here, the mess doesn't bother me at all. As I said before, when I'm doing bigger sections of this, I've got dust protection and stuff on to keep it to a minimum. But for anyone that's overly concerned about dust, I suggest a different type of project. Well, this is one of those projects that could easily turn into a 3-hour video, but I need to get the project done, so I'm just going to show you one more little technique I use for blending these splices, because in the final installation, the splices are probably the quickest giveaway to the fact that this is a box beam or a faux beam and not a solid beam. So let me zoom in and show you that. One of the main issues I found at the splices on these beams is no matter how much the grain matches up, the density of wood from one piece to the other often varies. So when I go across the joint with the restorer tool, it tears out more on the softer piece and less on the harder piece. And that kind of accentuates the glue line that's left behind from putting these splices together. So to kind of disguise that a little bit more, I used a super coarse rasp. This is one made by some French company, and these teeth are super sharp and very long and aggressive. And I found that by just rubbing the file crossways like this, it tends to cut both pieces of the wood the same, so the grain flows through. And it's more important that the wood grain texture flows through than the fact that this piece of wood is lighter in color than that piece. But the teeth on that file quickly blend that grain texture through and cut away the little bit of glue that's on the surfaces of that miter where these pieces come together. Another thing that's important to keep in mind with a project like this, as far as disguising the fact that boards are turning into beams, is that for this particular project, it gets this aged, weathered finish. This is like a 5-step process with various stains and various techniques that serve to even out the tone of the wood. So for places like this where some wood is lighter and some wood is darker, that stain process is the last bit of magic I use to achieve a solid beam look from individual boards. In closing, I want to give a shout out to patrons of the Next Level Carpentry channel that help support video production like this during lulls in the video production schedule with different challenges in the YouTube content producing business. So thanks to new and old patrons, one and all, and for anyone that sees this video and is interested in becoming a patron to the channel, I can tell you that there's been a few patron-only videos that go more in depth on the construction of these beams and some scenes from the project itself where these end up getting installed. So if you're motivated to do that, check the link to Patreon in the video description and sign up if that's something you're interested in. And with that shameless plug for support aside, I'll wrap this video up by saying, as always, and until next time, thanks for watching. Well, what I should be doing here at the end of this video is cleaning up the mess that I made in the shop. But I don't feel like doing that right now, so I'll just share with you my latest favorite saying. There it is. And frankly, I can't think of many things that are more true or more profound.